Montana 2000. A quiet town tucked against the foothills of the Bitterroot Mountains. Endless pine forests winding two-lane highways, and a sky so wide it made you feel small. On the evening of September 12, 2000, that vastness swallowed 24-year-old Lena Harper, and for nearly a quarter century, no one knew why. She was the kind of woman people remembered without trying to. A teacher's aide at the local elementary school, she spent her days guiding second graders through reading lessons, and her evenings painting mountain sunsets in a tiny apartment above a bakery on Main Street. Friends called her gentle but strong-willed, the kind of person who smiled through hard days and never left without saying goodbye. That Tuesday had been ordinary. Too ordinary. Lena left school a little after 4 p.m., carrying a tote bag filled with graded papers and a sketchbook. She stopped by her favorite gas station just outside town. Security footage later showed her buying a bottle of water and a pack of gum, exchanging a wave with the cashier before heading east toward her apartment. She never arrived. When she didn't show up for work the next morning, her colleagues grew uneasy. By noon, her parents, Mark and Carol Harper, reported her missing. They told police it wasn't like her to disappear. Lena always called if she was running late, even by a few minutes. Within hours, search teams were combing the roads between the school and her apartment. Late that night, deputies found her silver Honda Civic parked on an old service road near the edge of the Bitterroot Forest. The driver's door was ajar, the keys still in the ignition. Her purse sat on the passenger seat. A set of footprints led away from the car toward the trees, then vanished into the darkness. For the next 10 days, the search consumed the entire county. Volunteers on horseback, helicopters sweeping low over the treetops, and locals leaving food and blankets at the fire station for rescuers. But as autumn deepened and temperatures dropped, hope began to slip through everyone's fingers. On September 23rd, a hunter discovered what remained of Lena deep inside a thicket, nearly 6 miles from the road. Her shoes were missing, her clothing torn, and beside her lay a single earring, a delicate silver feather her mother recognized instantly. The coroner ruled her death a homicide, but evidence was scarce. The rugged terrain had erased nearly every trace. Investigators found partial footprints, degraded fibers, and a broken chain near the site, but nothing conclusive. There were no witnesses, no clear suspects, and no confession. For months, the Harper family lived in suspended grief. The investigation slowed, then stalled entirely by 2002. Detectives interviewed co-workers, ex-boyfriends, even transients passing through town, but every lead dissolved into nothing. It was like she vanished twice, her father said later, once from the earth and once from the system. The town of Clearwater Falls carried the wound quietly. Locals still mentioned Lena's name in lowered voices. The annual school fair held a moment of silence each September, a tradition that lasted years beyond her students' graduation. Detective Alan Riggs, the original lead on the case, kept Lena's file long after it was transferred to storage. He'd been a young investigator then, barely 30, full of drive and determination. By 2010, he'd moved to a different district, but he never forgot her face. Every few months, he'd call the county office, asking if anything new had surfaced. The answer was always the same: nothing. And then, in early 2023, everything changed. It started with a phone call from a woman in her 40s named Bethany Cole, who'd recently moved back to Montana after years in Oregon. She'd seen a local news segment about cold cases being re-examined with new technology and decided to reach out. "I don't know if what I remember matters," she told the detective on duty, "but I saw something that night. I just didn't realize what it was." She explained that back in 2000, she'd been a 20-year-old waitress working the late shift at a diner near Route 93. Around 8:30 p.m., she served coffee to a man she didn't recognize. Tall, heavy-set, wearing a brown jacket and work boots caked with mud. He seemed agitated, kept glancing out the window toward the parking lot. When she tried to make small talk, he mumbled something about losing his keys in the woods and left without paying. What stuck with her, she said, wasn't his face but his truck, a faded red Chevy with a dented tailgate and a missing headlight. For decades, she dismissed it as nothing more than an odd customer. But when she saw Lena's photo again on the news, the date, the area, the hour, it hit her that the man might have been connected. "I don't know why I didn't speak sooner," she told police. "Maybe I didn't want to believe it." Detective Riggs, now semi-retired but still consulting on cold cases, was called in to review her statement. It stirred something he'd buried years before, the frustration of a case that had slipped through his hands. He requested the original files from evidence storage. What he found both amazed and infuriated him. Several pieces of physical evidence, including a fabric scrap and the broken chain found near the scene, had never been tested with modern techniques. Back in 2000, DNA testing was limited. Partial or degraded samples were often considered useless. But in 2023, even the smallest trace could speak volumes. Riggs contacted the Montana State Crime Lab, requesting advanced touch DNA analysis on the preserved items. Weeks turned into months, as forensic experts carefully extracted microscopic material from the chain's clasp and the inner lining of the fabric. When results finally arrived, the lab called Riggs personally. They had a match. The DNA belonged to Royden Roy Hale, a local mechanic who had lived less than 5 miles from the area where Lena's car was found. He'd been questioned briefly in 2001, but dismissed due to lack of evidence. At the time, he'd claimed he was homesick that night, with no one to verify his alibi. Now, nearly 23 years later, science had done what memory and manpower could not. It had caught up to him. On a grey March morning in 2024, law enforcement quietly surrounded Hale's small farmhouse outside Clearwater Falls. He opened the door, still wearing grease-stained coveralls, confused to see the cluster of unmarked vehicles in his driveway. When they told him why they were there, his expression didn't change. "That was a long time ago," he muttered. Almost to himself, he didn't resist arrest. The news spread through Montana like wildfire. Headlines ran statewide. Cold case solved after 23 years. New witness, old evidence bring breakthrough. For the Harper family, the phone call came from Riggs himself. "We have him," he said simply. Carol Harper later said she sat in silence for several minutes before whispering, "It's over." But in Clearwater Falls, closure came mixed with disbelief. Roy Hale had fixed half the town's cars. He'd attended church picnics, volunteered at the firehouse, and was known for giving free oil changes to single mothers. No one could reconcile the friendly mechanic with the man now accused of murder. The trial would reveal the truth, but the truth, as always, would come with its own ghosts. When the news broke, Clearwater Falls froze. In a town of fewer than 6,000 people, everyone knew Roy Hale, or at least they thought they did. He was the man who fixed your truck on a Sunday, who'd stopped to help change a flat tire in the snow, who played Santa at the community center every December. That was what made the arrest so hard to believe. The idea that someone like him could have done something so brutal felt impossible. But the DNA didn't lie. Detectives from the Montana Bureau of Investigation joined the case, working alongside local deputies to rebuild a timeline from 2000. The first order of business was to search Hale's property, which hadn't changed much over the years. His house sat on a narrow gravel road lined with old pine trees, the kind that creaked when the wind blew through. In the backyard stood a detached garage, cluttered with rusted car parts, tools, and oil drums. During the search, investigators found several boxes stored in the attic. Most contained old receipts and vehicle titles, but one box caught their attention. Inside were personal items, a bracelet, a hair clip, and a Polaroid photo of a young woman with short brown hair. The photo wasn't Lena, but the style and time period matched. Beneath it was a torn page from a local newspaper, dated October 2000, covering the early stages of Lena's disappearance. Someone had circled her picture in pen, When asked about it during questioning, Hale said he didn't remember keeping the clipping. His voice was calm, detached, as though discussing someone else's life entirely. People talked about her all the time back then, he said. Guess I just kept the paper. Don't know why. Detective Riggs sat across from him in the interrogation room, a recorder between them. 2 decades hadn't dulled his instincts. You worked near the area where her car was found, Riggs said evenly. You told officers you were home that night. That's what you said then. You want to change that now? Hale stared at the table for a long time before answering. I already told you everything I remember, but when confronted with the DNA evidence, his demeanor shifted just slightly. He stopped denying, but he didn't admit either. You think you've got something, he said quietly. You don't know what happened. For Riggs, that was confirmation enough. He'd seen it before, guilt wearing the mask of stubbornness. We will, he said. We always do. The prosecutor decided to charge Hale with first-degree murder, citing the DNA match, the proximity to the scene, and inconsistencies in his old statements. During the pre-trial hearings, more details began to surface. 2 of Hale's former co-workers came forward, recalling that he'd shown up late to work the morning after Lena disappeared. Covered in mud, his truck's front bumper newly dented. He told them he'd hit a deer. One of them, a man named Steve Harlan, testified that Hale had been jittery for weeks afterward, snapping at small things and once muttering, "Some folks just shouldn't walk alone." The deeper investigators dug, the more the puzzle began to take shape. In the original 2000 report, there had been mention of a missing tire iron from Hale's garage, something he'd claimed to have loaned out. When detectives searched the property again in 2024, they found a rusted tire iron buried behind the shed. Lab results later revealed faint traces of blood, too degraded for a full DNA profile, but consistent with Lena's. The prosecution didn't need a confession. The evidence spoke loud enough. Meanwhile, the Harper family tried to process the sudden flood of information. Carol Harper, now 68, found herself reliving memories she'd spent years trying to tuck away. I thought I'd stopped imagining that phone call, she told a local reporter, the one that never came. But when it finally did, I didn't know how to feel. Her husband, Mark, was quieter. He spent his mornings walking to the old bridge outside town, the same route he used to search when Lena first went missing. There's something cruel about time, he said once. It takes everything from you, then gives it back when you're too tired to carry it. In Clearwater Falls, the arrest fractured old friendships. Hale's sister, who still lived in town, faced harassment from locals who blamed her for not seeing the signs. At the diner where Bethany Cole had once worked, customers left notes of support taped to the window for her bravery in coming forward after all those years. It's never too late to speak, one note read in neat handwriting. Reporters swarmed the area, filming outside the courthouse and replaying the same footage of Hale being led in handcuffs, head down, expression unreadable. Commentators speculated about motive, about whether the murder had been planned or opportunistic. But for those who'd lived through 2000, the truth was simpler. They finally had a name. When the trial began in late 2024, the courtroom filled every day. Journalists, families, former students of Lena's, all came to witness the conclusion of something that had haunted them for 23 years. The prosecution laid out its case methodically, piece by piece. They showed maps of the forest area, played recordings of Hale's interviews, and presented the DNA evidence in clear clinical language. The defense, with little to counter, leaned heavily on the passage of time. Memories fade, the defense attorney argued. Evidence degrades. How can anyone be sure after nearly a quarter of a century? But then, in a twist no one saw coming, Bethany Cole took the stand. Nervous but resolute, she described the man in the diner, the missing headlight, the nervous eyes that kept darting to the parking lot. When asked if she saw that man in court, she pointed directly at Hale. I didn't want to believe it, she said softly, But I've seen those eyes before. The moment hung heavy in the air. Hale didn't look at her. He didn't look at anyone. For the Harper family, those words were everything. After years of silence, someone had finally spoken the truth. Outside, the community rallied in quiet ways. A local artist painted a mural of Lena on the side of the elementary school where she'd once worked. A smiling portrait surrounded by her students' handprints. The caption read, "Always remembered, never forgotten." Detective Riggs attended the trial every day. He sat near the back, notebook in hand, a habit he hadn't broken in 30 years. For him, it wasn't just about the case. It was about unfinished work. He'd carried Lena's file through transfers, promotions, and near retirement. Seeing Hale finally held accountable was the closest thing to peace he'd known in his career. When the closing arguments ended, and the jury retreated for deliberation, Riggs stayed seated long after everyone else had left. He stared at the empty defense table, the worn wood that had heard lies, truths, and everything in between. He whispered under his breath, "We got there. Lena, we finally got there." The courtroom was silent when the jury returned. The kind of silence that hums beneath the skin, charged with too many years of waiting. Carol Harper sat between her husband and her son, her hands trembling in her lap. 23 years of pain had led to this moment, and yet she didn't dare to breathe. Roy Hale sat motionless at the defense table, his wrists cuffed in front of him, his lawyer whispering something he didn't seem to hear. He looked older than he had when the trial began, hair thinner, face pale, eyes hollow. The foreman handed the verdict slip to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. The courtroom doors creaked as a late gust of wind swept through the hall, and even that sound made people flinch. The judge unfolded the paper and read aloud. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Roy Allen Hale, guilty of the charge of murder in the first degree." The words rippled through the room like a thunderclap. Carol gasped, covering her mouth, tears flooding her eyes before she even realized she was crying. Her husband gripped her hand so tightly it hurt, but neither of them let go. On the other side of the room, a few people bowed their heads. One of Hale's sisters began to sob quietly, her shoulders shaking, but no one turned toward her. Hale didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stared at the table in front of him, the same way he had the day detectives came knocking on his door, as if he knew this moment had been waiting for him all along. The judge thanked the jury, dismissed them, and scheduled sentencing for the following week. As the deputies led Hale away, Carol watched him go, her tears still streaming, but her expression hardened. She whispered something no one else heard. "You can't hurt her anymore." Outside the courthouse, the winter wind was sharp. Reporters crowded the steps, cameras flashing, microphones raised. "Mrs. Harper, how do you feel?" one shouted. "Do you think justice has been served?" Carol paused, her voice unsteady but clear. "Justice?" she said softly. "There's no justice for something like this. But there's truth now, and sometimes that's all that's left." Her words aired that evening across every local news channel in Montana. In Clearwater Falls, people gathered around televisions and phones to watch the verdict replayed over and over. Some cried, some nodded in silence. Some just turned off the screen and sat in the quiet, remembering the night Lena disappeared, the search parties, the candlelight vigils, the missing posters that had fluttered in the cold wind like prayers. That night Carol couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, staring at the snow falling over the yard. Mark joined her after midnight, wrapping an old blanket around her shoulders. They didn't say much. After so many years of talking, pleading, remembering, silence felt like the only honest language left. The next morning, Detective Riggs stopped by the Harper house. He didn't come for an interview or a statement. He just came to say goodbye. After the trial, he planned to retire, not because he was tired, but because he finally could. Carol hugged him at the door, her voice breaking. "You gave her back to us," she said. Riggs shook his head gently. "No," he said. You kept her alive. All these years. He stepped off the porch, pulling his coat tighter, and walked toward his truck. The snow crunched under his boots. Before he got in, he turned back for one last look at the little house where the Harpers had waited for nearly a quarter century. A house full of memories and grief, and now, at last, a sliver of peace. At the sentencing hearing the following week, the courtroom was once again packed. Hale stood, silent and expressionless, as the judge read the sentence: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. There was no outburst, no drama. Just a dull finality, the kind that lingers long after the words fade. When the judge asked if Hale wanted to speak, he hesitated for a long time. Then in a low, flat voice he said, "I didn't mean for it to happen." Carol closed her eyes. For 23 years she'd imagined hearing those words, or something like them. But when they finally came, they meant nothing. There was no remorse in them, no truth. Just the hollow echo of a man who'd destroyed a life and buried the evidence beneath years of silence. After the hearing, reporters swarmed outside again, but Carol and her family slipped out through a side door. They drove straight to the edge of the forest where Lena's remains had been found. The same trail where volunteers had once searched with flashlights and dogs. The place looked different now, overgrown, quieter, the trees older and denser. But the air carried the same chill. Carol placed a small bouquet of wildflowers at the base of a birch tree. "You're free now," she whispered. Her son, who'd been a teenager when Lena disappeared, stood beside her, his eyes fixed on the forest. "Do you think she knew him?" he asked quietly. Carol shook her head. "I don't think it matters anymore." In the weeks that followed, Clearwater Falls began to breathe again. The mural of Lena outside the school became a place where people left flowers and notes, not just about her, but about their own lost loved ones. "For Lena," one note read, "and for everyone still waiting for answers." Bethany Cole returned to the diner where she'd worked as a teenager, just to see it. It had changed hands twice since then, but the same old clock still hung above the counter, ticking steadily like it had for decades. In what used to be the basement, investigators found an old storage trunk filled with personal items, women's jewelry, scraps of fabric, and a cracked Polaroid camera. Among them was a silver charm bracelet, engraved with the initials R.W. Mercer recognized it immediately. Rachel's mother had mentioned it during her first interview, saying it was a birthday gift Rachel wore almost every day. The evidence was enough to reopen the case formally. Charles Klein, now 73, was living in a nursing home outside Des Moines. Mercer coordinated with Iowa authorities to arrange an interview. He found Klein sitting by a window, overlooking a gray parking lot, oxygen tube looped around his nose, a thin blanket over his knees. His eyes were clouded, but there was something sharp still hiding behind them. "Klein," Mercer began, taking a seat across from him, "you remember a girl named Rachel Whitaker?" Klein's lips twitched, just barely. "Can't say I do." Mercer set a photograph on the table, Rachel smiling in front of her classroom. "You lived 4 miles from where her car was found. You told deputies you were out of town that night, but your employer's records don't back that up." Klein's gaze shifted toward the photo, then away again. "That was a long time ago." "People forget things," Mercer leaned in. "Not me. I don't forget." The silence stretched long enough for the hum of the oxygen machine to fill the room. Then finally Klein spoke, his voice rough and low. "Lot of girls disappeared back then. It ain't my fault if one of them wandered off. It wasn't a confession, but Mercer knew it was close. After the interview, Klein's DNA was collected with a warrant and rushed to the lab. 3 weeks later, the results came back. It was an exact match to the unidentified sample found on Rachel's jacket and under her fingernails. Forensic confirmation after 17 years. When the call came in, Mercer sat quietly at his desk, eyes fixed on the framed photograph of Rachel from the original caseboard. He whispered to himself, "We got him, kid. We finally got him. The arrest made headlines across Nebraska. Cold case solved after 17 years. Retired trucker linked by DNA to teacher's murder. Reporters swarmed Clayridge, cameras rolling outside the sheriff's office. The small town that had long tried to forget now had to remember everything. Rachel's parents, Tom and Evelyn Whitaker, were notified personally by Mercer. They sat in silence as he explained the new evidence. Evelyn covered her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. All these years, she whispered, I thought she was just gone, but he was right there. He was right there. Tom, now 72, stared out the window, jaw tight. I saw that man at the feed store every week. He looked me in the eye. Hardy pie at the diner next to my wife. And all this time he knew. Within days, the Clayridge community was shaken to its core. People who had once worked alongside Klein, who'd trusted him to drive their children to school or fix their tractors, couldn't reconcile. The man they knew with the monster, described in the arrest reports local. News stations replayed old footage from 2002, search parties trudging through fields, candlelight vigils, Rachel's smiling school photo. A generation that had grown up hearing her name as a whispered memory now watched justice finally begin to take form. Klein was extradited back to Nebraska to stand trial for first-degree murder and kidnapping. During his arraignment, he sat motionless, thin hands folded, eyes downcast. When asked if he had anything to say, he only muttered, "Wasn't supposed to go that far." For Mercer, it